There's an old expression that I'm sure is familiar to all of us, and perhaps one that you have used yourself. Put your money where your mouth is. That's where Jesus is coming from this morning, with these two seemingly sort of disparate stories, but they come together in sort of a unique way in the way Mark tells the story of Jesus and the way he has the arc of the storyline moving through his account of the gospel. As always, it's kind of good to pause for a moment and remember where we are and where in Jesus' life we are. All of this, of course, takes place at the temple, and Jesus, therefore, is in Jerusalem. He has made that journey from the countryside. He's left behind him all of the teaching and the preaching and the healing that he has done throughout the Judean countryside and up through Galilee and into Samaria. And he has, with his close circle of disciples, and apparently many others, has now entered the holy city of Jerusalem. One of the pieces we missed in the gospel was the story of the triumphal entry. Remember, where the people laid down palm branches and their coats on the ground, and Jesus rides into the city on the colt of an ass. And so the whole Palm Sunday story that we hold until Holy Week has already occurred. And now Jesus is talking truth to power. Jesus is talking truth to power. Oftentimes, and you can remember any number of instances, there have been great assemblies or great rallies or great speeches given in this country in Washington, D.C. Because when you gather at the Capitol, when you gather in front of those great and magnificent buildings to make a point, you're speaking not just to the assembly in front of you, but to a much larger audience. You're making a national statement in those circumstances. Jesus is doing the same thing. He hasn't assembled large crowds before the reflecting pond. He's not standing on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial, but he's right across the street from the temple. The temple is the heart and soul of Jewish religion, Jewish tradition, Jewish teaching, Jewish action. And Jesus, who's always a careful observer of human life, is watching what's going on in this great city, this great walled capital city at the heart of Judea, where the powers of the earthly powers of the empire of Rome and the heavenly powers of the Jewish people at the temple collide, where the friction generates a certain amount of heat. And Jesus is adding a little more fuel to the fire. Jesus is going to make a great public statement later this week on a day of the week we call Friday. But he's preparing the ground. He's stoking the fire. He's adding a few more coals. And he's watching and waiting and listening and speaking. In the first story in this assemblage that Mark has given us this morning, Jesus is looking at the scribes and the Pharisees, the great leaders of the Jewish religion, of the Jewish faith. He's looking at them and he's watching them as they too are bringing their offerings. We're coming up on the Passover, and the Passover was a pilgrimage. Anyone who could, who was of the Jewish faith, came to Jerusalem for the Passover to get their Passover lamb that was slaughtered according to custom in the temple itself. And Jesus is watching these people coming from throughout the countryside and around the region. And many scribes and Pharisees come from outside the region. And he's looking at them in their long flowing robes and the big show that they make of the money that they put into the treasury. Because the great collection box was actually set at the front door of the temple. That's where you made your money offerings. And as he's watching them, he notices that they don't just come up and put their money in. They dress for the occasion. They want to be seen. They maybe had an escort that came with them, so all the people who were gathered around it had come into the city. These hicks from the sticks, if you will, along with the urban Jerusalemites, are watching all of this to see, well, who is that? He must be somebody really important. And he makes his offering. And when they made their offering, they also would say a prayer. But these were very long and extravagant prayers, and in fact, you might want to think of them more like many of the campaign speeches we've recently heard in this country as we come off our general election. The Sadducees and the Pharisees and the priests and the other leaders are giving their vision for the future of Judaism, giving their vision of how the church, if you will, should respond to all of the needs of the people. And not unlike our own American political system and political systems around the world, they weren't all of the same way of thinking. They had their own version of conservatives and liberals at the time, and they had very different visions for how their country, how their people, how the Jewish people should act and lead their lives. So really these long prayers that are being delivered are in a way persuasive speeches, letting the people know which factions were on which side of an issue, and they're looking for followers. Much as Jesus had followers, many of these great Jewish leaders also had followers who listened to them and who followed their tenets and their teaching. And Jesus is looking at them. And he's looking at the large sums of money that they made a big show of putting in. In fact, some scholars say that they'd come with like bags of gold, but they sort of padded the bags. So sometimes it looked like there was more in there than there really was. So we don't know, but that's one of the theories behind. So what we're seeing is these people putting in these great sums of money and making these great speeches and telling you that, wanting to know, are you better off today than you were 4 years ago, the last time I was here? Are you satisfied with the direction of the Jewish people? Are you satisfied with where we're going? What is your vision? Will you share my vision? Because in these long prayers, they're telling about all the wonderful things that God will do if you only follow God the way that person follows. There's some uncomfortable echoes in my telling of that story with our own campaigns and elections. But it's a human story. And the echoes really come from a shared and common humanity. The names are different, the places are different, the time is different, the circumstances are different. Human beings, not so much. We haven't changed all that much. We're still seeking attention and power and glory and adulation. We're still looking for people to see the world through our eyes. But what Jesus knew, and what most of the people in Jerusalem knew, that there was more talk than action in those long prayers delivered on the steps of the temple. That things didn't change all that much. That it didn't really matter who you were following or which way you were going. There were some things that never seemed to change. And Mark is reminding us that there were those things that never seemed to change very powerfully and very graphically. Because right away after that story about all the power and the glory and the persuasion and the prayers and the great offerings, he tells the story of this widow. Now, I think it's important. I think it was important to Jesus. I think it was very important to the evangelist Mark that we don't know the widow's name. Oftentimes in the Gospels, particularly I think is true in Mark, when someone who encounters Jesus is not named, they are a type. They are a type, which means he's not necessarily talking about a specific widow, but he's talking about widows. And again, to remember kind of the biblical shorthand, anytime we're talking about widows and orphans, we're talking about the people on the margins in general. It's sort of shorthand for the people who are on the edges of society, the poor people, the people who don't have any kind of social standing, the people who may be enslaved. Remember, the Romans had slaves, and many of them were Jewish. It was a very different kind of a slavery than we had in this country, sadly, at one point. But nevertheless, they're servants, they're slaves, they're people at all different stations of life. And whenever we hear widows and orphans, we know we're looking for the poorest of the poor, the most marginalized. So this widow may stand for all of those people. And she comes forward and she puts in those 2 little coins. Those of you who are scholars of the King James Bible will remember it was called a mite, the widow's mite, because it was so tiny. And she puts that, she very quietly goes up the steps, almost, I'm sure, unnoticed by the crowds who are distracted by all the goings-on in the great city at a time when all these people were gathered. And she very humbly and quietly drops that little bit in the box and perhaps is a little ashamed that that's all she has to offer. And she comes down and sort of disappears into the crowd. And Jesus tells his disciples, he said, "Did you see that? Did you see that? What she did was a greater offering than all the other offerings we've seen. She is marginalized, she is poor, she's broken, she's downtrodden. She's not really a part as a widow, she's not even a part really, an integral part of our society. And she goes up there and she does and makes that action. And she gives not of her abundance, not a little bit out of all the stuff that she has stored up in the world, but basically she gives everything she has. So she has given more than all these other people because she's given everything. And a little Greek lesson here. A little Greek lesson. I don't think the translators, well, they're uncomfortable with this, so they're a little careful. But the translators are kind of editorializing a little because that last phrase in today's gospel, she gives all she has to live on, all she had to live on. The translators are a little uncomfortable with the Greek because in Greek, the last phrase says, she gave her, and I'll use the Greek word, she gave her bios. She gave her bios, B-I-O-S, bios. That's the same word from which we get our modern word biology. Biology is the study of life. So when Mark writes that she gave her bios, she puts the words in Jesus' mouth that she gave her life at the temple. Now, as I say, the translators get a little uncomfortable because we don't want to make this sound like it's sort of a ritual or ecclesiastical sacrifice, you know, some sort of suicidal pledge to God or something like that. So I think they're trying to kind of soften it a little bit. But I think it's important to know that what Mark wanted us to know is Jesus is telling us she gave all of herself. She gave her total being. And she didn't give it in the form of money. Because by saying she gave her life, it's not just all she had, but she's giving herself to God. She's making all of her life, all of her being, all that she is, a living offering to God. If you will, a living sacrifice. And I use that word carefully. Not unto death, but she's giving the fullness of her being to God. And none of the loudmouths in the fancy robes who've been strutting around and making those long prayers and great speeches about what he's going to do and what you can, if you'll only follow me, what we can do together to change the direction of our great people. They're not willing to do that. They're going to go home to comfort. They're going to go home to all their servants, to their plush accommodations. They're going to go home to people who are literally waiting on them hand and foot as they recline on a bench, with people peeling and feeding them grapes and bringing them great joints of meat, bringing them the freshest bread, fanning them if it's a hot day. And she gives everything she has. We've just listened to a round of those kinds of speeches from liberals and conservatives, promising all kinds of things, saying how they'll make everything so much the better. So we're watching now with Jesus and the disciples. We're watching to see how this all plays out and where it goes. And we know that we're in a season of change. Every election cycle brings a season of change, and change is uncomfortable at times. Change brings the uncertain, and the uncertain brings fear because we don't know what's next. We don't, good or bad, whichever way things might go, however you feel about it, but it's going to bring some change. And that's an uncomfortable feeling. I think it might be particularly uncomfortable sometimes for Episcopalians. You know the old story? How many Episcopalians does it take to change a light bulb? Change? So we feel that. And what God calls on us to do, in response to all the great speeches and the long prayers on the steps of the temple and the great speeches and all the hot air that's been expended in an election campaign across the country, what God calls on us to do is the same thing God has always called on us to do, which is to give our lives to God. To give our lives to God's will, God's love, God's teaching. The widows are among us. The widows and orphans at the margins are here. They were here before the election. They're going to be here after the election. People who are hungry, who are alone, who are afraid. People who are trying to run from oppression and find a safe place to be were here before, and they'll be here after. And what we're called to do has not changed. We are called to walk up those steps with the widow. We are called to walk up those steps in the temple and to lay everything that we have in service to God on the altar. We're called on to care for the widows and the orphans, to love the outsider, to welcome the alien and the immigrant from another land. We are called upon by God to be kind, to be gentle, to be loving, to be non-judgmental. I can find you scripture citations for every one of those words that I just mentioned, so it's not me talking, it's God. It's God talking. And God doesn't need you to pick sides and listen to the great speeches and prayers and decide which way you think you might do best to follow. God calls on you to do the same thing that God has always been calling on you to do and always will be calling on you to do. As we listen to the letter to the Hebrews that we've been hearing the last few weeks in church, and it'll go on until the end of this season, till the first Sunday in Advent, we don't quite get as far in that book as I wish we did, because there's one verse that doesn't come up, I think it's till chapter 13, and we won't quite get there this year. There's one verse that I think is really important, and the letter to the Hebrews tells us that Jesus Christ is the same yesterday, today, and forever. Jesus is the same yesterday, today, and forever. Our call to love, to care, to respect, to heal, to welcome is Jesus' call. Our call is the same yesterday, today, and forever. Oh, if you are feeling angry and upset and frightened or goofy or something and need to let off some steam, go let off some steam. I don't care. Please don't post it on my Facebook account, because I'm getting enough of it from others. But then once you kind of calm down a little bit, remember that your call to love and service is the same yesterday, today, and forever. That Jesus has not changed. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter who's standing and preaching on the steps and praying on the steps of the temple in Jerusalem, or who's crowing on some dais at an election campaign. It matters what we do, where our hearts are, and how we follow the will of God. It's not for nothing. It's not for nothing that we have the baptismal covenant. Will you seek to serve Christ in all persons? Will you respect the dignity of every human being? That promise before God at this altar that you made and that you renew on a regular basis is the same yesterday, today, and forever. Jesus is the same yesterday, today, and forever. The world will change as it does and as it changes all the time. The 24-hour news cycle feeds us with the changes that are happening every minute of every day in seemingly every corner of the planet. God is unchanged and unchangeable. God is love, and that love is steadfast and solid, and that love feeds us and sustains us. God gave us that love in the person of Jesus Christ. One of my very favorite Christmas hymns, it's coming up soon. Love came down at Christmas. Love came down at Christmas, and Jesus died for us. And he didn't die for nothing. He died so that we might live and have abundance of life. And that life is the life that we're called to offer back to God. Because of that gift, we give ourselves, our hearts, our souls. Teacher, what is the greatest commandment? Jesus said, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your mind, with all your soul, and with all your strength. And the second is like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. Upon these two commandments hang all the law and the prophets. Yesterday, today, and forever.